Hello, I'm Marcy Craig Post, Executive Director of the International Reading Association, the world's leading organization for literacy professionals. At IRA, we recognize that education is at a critical juncture. The discussion today will have enormous impact on public policy and ultimately affect students and better prepare them to be contributing members of society. We hope this debate will be informative, provoke dialogue and discussion, and help shape the framework on education policy moving forward.
Good evening. Teachers College presents Taking the Election to School, Making Education a Focus of the 2012 Election, a debate between John Schnurr, Education Advisor to the Obama presidential campaign, and Phil Handy, Education Advisor to Republican nominee Mitt Romney. Live webcast brought to you by Education Week with support from the International Reading Association. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Susan Furman, President of Teachers College.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Furman, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Taking the Election to School, a debate between education advisors to the two major party presidential candidates. In addition to our live audience here tonight, I want to extend greetings to those of you who are watching the live webcast of this debate at home on the Education Week website, and to thank Education Week and the International Reading Association for its sponsorship, and those joining us from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. We're absolutely delighted to be hosting this event here at Teachers College, and we have to thank our dear alumna and friend and member of my Presidential Advisory Committee, Phyllis Kossoff, who is sponsoring this lecture tonight. Phyllis, would you stand up? Education should be a central issue in national elections, and for good reason. Everyone agrees it's among the most important, if not the most important factor in ensuring our country's future, in its own right to produce educated citizens, but also as education addresses economic challenges, national security, global relationships, the environment, and virtually every major issue that faces us. Few are more familiar with these concerns than our two speakers tonight. Phil Handy is a former chairman of the Florida State Board of Education and the higher education co-chair of Governor Romney's Education Policy Advisory Group. He also co-chairs Governor Romney's Florida presidential campaign and is co-chairman of the National Policy Council on Education for the governor. Mr. Handy was a member of the Board of Overseers of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and currently serves as an advisor to the Program on Educational Policy and Governance at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and as director of Stand for Children. He was state chairman of Jeb Bush's gubernatorial campaigns in Florida in the 90s and co-chairman of the 2002 gubernatorial campaign. John Schnurr is participating in his capacity as advisor to the Obama presidential campaign. John is the co-founder and executive chairman of America Achieves, a nonprofit organization helping communities and states leverage leadership, policy, and practice to build high-quality educational systems. He also advises philanthropists seeking to improve education, including Bloomberg Philanthropies. In 2000, John co-founded New Leaders for New Schools and served as its CEO until last year, when he took a leave of absence from that post in 2008 and 2009 to join the Obama for America presidential campaign, and he was a senior advisor to President Obama's transition team and to U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. In the 1990s, he served as President Clinton's White House Associate Director for Educational Policy and was also a special advisor and assistant in the Department of Education. I am told that these two have debated each other before and are old hands at this sort of debate, but we do have a format here. I'm going to begin by asking each of our speakers a question individually, one that they chose, that is intended to allow us all to become familiar with the basic ideas about education that are embraced by the respective campaigns. I will then ask several questions to both candidates that aim at providing a comprehensive and deeper perspective on their candidates' views on a range of educational issues. I may draw on questions pre-submitted by our Washington, D.C. alumni from the National Press Club, our faculty, and the TC community here in the audience this evening. Thank you for those suggestions. I'll conclude with a question from the Education Week audience and an opportunity for each speaker to provide closing statements. Each speaker will have up to 4 minutes to respond to each question, but we hope they'll be succinct so we can cover more topics. I will ask follow-up questions as they occur, and I will also see if each of you wants to respond to something the other said. Following the debate, the audience members are invited to remain with us for a panel discussion moderated by Mark Baumster, a national editor for Education Week, and including our faculty member, Jeffrey Hennig, Education Week reporter Allison Klein, and Liz Willen of our own Hechinger Institute. I'm also going to ask everybody to behave well. No interruptions or outbursts, and please remember that this event is being webcast live, which means keeping relatively still and quiet. So let me start alphabetically with Phil Handy with the question that you wanted to be posed first. The federal government's contribution to K-12 funding in the United States is about 10%, while state and local governments fund the remainder. Given this fact, what role would the federal government play in a Romney administration?
What role would the federal government play in education in the Romney administration?
Right.
And there's a long, certainly, history of the federal government's involvement, starting with land-grant colleges 220 years ago, and there is a role for federal government, so any discussion about eliminating the Department of Education or somehow eliminating the federal role is probably not well-founded, at least as it relates to our candidacy. But I think there's basically two roles for the federal government. One is the role of transparency and telling the truth. I found that when I was the State Board of Education chairman in Florida, that American public education is hindered significantly by the inability sometimes to tell the truth. It goes with the political process, since politicians generally last a short period of time and the child's education lasts a long period of time. So the federal government is, I think, mandated with the responsibility for transparency and for the collection of data, honest data, and transparent data that empowers the consumer, the parent, the child, educators, leaders in their decisions about public education. And secondly, I think it's to create an environment that allows a freer ability for choice in public education. So to do away with, if you will, the constraints or the issues that constrain parents' ability to choose, to empower the monopoly. It's an attempt to try to level the playing field, if you will, to provide a greater empowerment for parents and kids. And I think there's thousands of policy issues that go inside that, but fundamentally is to tell the truth, to help states and districts and schools to tell the truth, and it's to empower competition and give parents the choice. We believe that no child should be obligated to go to school just because they were born in a certain zip code, and that's the essence of choice for us.
Okay, I'm going to ask John the opening question, but maybe we'll follow up to that question after. John, you've advised President Obama since he was a U.S. Senator. What have been his core beliefs and views about education over the years, and how does the Obama administration's work reflect those?
Yeah. Thank you, Susan, and it's great to be here with you and Phil. While we may have disagreements, and our candidates may have some strong disagreements on issues like education, Phil is a wonderful person and leader, so it's great to be here with you, Phil.
Thanks, John.
President Obama, sometimes as a president you get known for your policies, and I think policies are important, but policies are grounded in core beliefs. and experiences. And I have, over the years, had a chance to sort of witness him from early in his time as a US Senator make decisions about education that are essentially grounded in a certain core beliefs that continue today. Number one, every interaction I've ever seen with him, he is very, very focused on how do we do much better by all our kids in the country in education, particularly those who are low income and underserved. He has always been very aware and dissatisfied with where we've been in education, even while knowing that, as he said many times, that he and Michelle Obama became who they were because of education in this country. They know it's a core value that has made possible the American dream in a real way, but we've shortchanged that, he's aware, because of his dissatisfaction. The story I'll tell briefly that I think highlights, where he comes from on education across his policies is in early January of 2009. Phil and I had debated a number of times in 2008. The president had won re-election. Education hadn't been a big topic in the campaign, although he continued to bring it up, including in many of the debates. As you know, in early January, we had just lost over 1.5 million jobs in 2 months. The economists had just declared that we'd gone into a recession that had started a year before, and it appeared to many that we potentially could be headed toward a Great Depression. The president, as in the transition, was working on an economic recovery plan to avert depression that was mostly needed to be focused on how to avert this short-term economic crisis. I had a meeting with him in early January on education for an hour in his transition offices when he was very clear that there was no economic stimulus plan that could be passed without a fundamental investment in the long-term drivers of our success in the country and economy, including a massive focus on education. At that moment in the stimulus, no one was talking about a large investment in education as part of the stimulus bill. No one was focused on reform in a serious way. And coming out of that meeting, he articulated some core principles that essentially guided his team to put together a package for him that wound up investing $100 billion out of the $800 billion economic recovery package in education, including that averted layoffs for over 400,000 teachers. It expanded funding for Head Start, it expanded funding for Pell, and it also coupled those investments in protection of job loss in education, just the time our kids didn't need more teachers to be cut off, our kids didn't need to be cut off from Pell or Head Start, with reform agenda. And he insisted that as part of that the package include what became the Race to the Top, the Invest in Innovation Fund, and reforms that eventually helped 46 states adopt higher standards, and now are putting in place assessments to match that in an effort to make better use of existing funds. And to watch him in that moment, when the responsibility of averting a depression was on his shoulders, and he insisted that a package could only be passed with that large of an investment in education, and those investments in access to education and reforms, to me was a reflection of the man I had gotten to know over the years, and as I'll get into tonight, underlie all of his policies from early learning to K-12 education to post-secondary. He knows it's key to access the American dream. He knows it's key to drive our economic competitiveness, and we can't let arguments, whether budget policy or federalism or anything else, keep the national government play a supportive role of state and local governments to ensure that kids get the education they need and deserve.
Thanks for those openings, and we're now going to get into some details. Let's start with the Common Core standards. 45 states have adopted Common Core standards. President Obama has supported the federal government's role in implementing the standards, but Governor Romney says he opposes using federal funds to support the Common Core. Could you elaborate a bit more about each candidate's position on the Common Core standards? And this time we'll start with you, John.
So yes, on the Common Core, as many people in the audience know, there's been an effort from states across the country, governors and state superintendents of education, to essentially replace a lot of the watered-down current academic standards in the country and a lot of the pretty mediocre fill-in-the-bubble multiple choice tests with a much more rigorous set of standards that reflect true readiness for success in college and careers. And that effort's come along with support, bipartisan support. Now 46 states have adopted these standards, and while standards alone don't drive improvement in education, you also need the investments and supports for kids and teachers to reach those. They really are key when we've been really kind of set our bar low in education. And in a way, and Phil talked about the importance of speaking about truth in American education or in anything. In education to this day, in a way, the low standards that we've set for our kids and the fill-in-the-bubble multiple choice tests that reflect this kind of low level of standard and are deciding how our kids or schools are doing based on that kind of standard and test has led us to be lying to our kids. That kids are told around the country that they're proficient on a mediocre test and that that's success, But in fact, they aren't ready for success, and we know it from the data, in college and careers. So the question is, how do we have a much more rigorous standard? So the president was clear this is a perfect example of his philosophy about the federal role in education, at least one of them, is that when there's state efforts to move an important innovation, in this case higher standards, the president really wanted to see that he could support that, and so incented the adoption of those standards and Race to the Top, and actually provided, knowing that standards would not be meaningful without much better assessments to replace the current assessments, set aside over $400 million of stimulus funding in order to support willing states to design the new Common Core of assessments that will be ready in the next couple of years to ensure that we really have assessments that measure what we care about our kids knowing: rigorous reading, rigorous math, critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills. And he thinks the states should determine those standards, but the federal government can play a supportive role in helping to finance making that happen.
What is the support beyond the initial support that is projected for the Common Core?
So again, this, out of the first stimulus funding, there was no one on any side who had sort of thought, hey, maybe we could use some of this funding to improve our long-term economy by funding the creation of the assessments. So we put aside the $400 million for the assessments. And then once the assessments are in place, and there are two consortia of states, as many people know, who are going to set the standards, decide on the assessments, it really leads to then what your philosophy on the federal role is. And I must say on this front, transparency and choice, I think, are in fact representative of a lot of the philosophy the Romney campaign has. I think the president views that you need deep investments in the supports for kids and for teachers to support those. You need more funding in education in a way to finance especially the low-income kids in schools who, without federal funding, wouldn't have a shot at this. There's 10 cents of every dollar goes to 10 cents of every education dollar comes from the federal government. But in high poverty schools, Title I schools, I've been in schools where 40 cents and the dollar comes. So the philosophy is let's invest in those, let's invest in equity, let's invest in teacher professional development, let's invest in preparing kids to be successful through early learning, to be ready to do well on those standards, and that provides a cornerstone of a second-term agenda.
Okay, Phil, the Common Core, no federal funds to support the Common Core. Do you want to pick up on that?
The Common Core started in the National Governors Association, and 46 governors willingly opted in to adopt the new standards, which are a very good idea. Standards make a lot of sense when put together with assessments, and we'll talk a little bit about assessments. Very simply put, it's from our standpoint, it's an opt-in program. It's a governor-led program, and it should be opted in. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about these waivers that have been given in response to No Child Left Behind, and the incentives that have been used to try to drive Common Core and drive assessment packages. I think we'll have some disagreement about that. But the Common Core should be opted in by governors, enacted by the states if they want to. So far, 46 have. It's part of the law of 46 different states, and it feels like it has plenty of momentum to move forward. The assessment packages, but both of them are, should ultimately be sponsored by the states. There's the equally divided now. I think there's 23 states have adopted each one. I think at the end of the day, we'll end up with one assessment package that makes sense, but it'll be opted in by the governors who would, and state boards and state legislatures who adopt them.
So let's pick up then on your statement about talking more about testing and assessment. And could you state the position on that, but also wrap it into the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or No Child Left Behind?
Well, I'd say initially, John and I, I'm glad to be back on the stage with John. I always enjoy being with John. And thank you for tonight's debate, by the way. Thank you very much for Teachers College. I would say that using federal funds for assessment and curriculum is a state responsibility, not a federal responsibility. Federal responsibility is to make sure the data is right and the data is correct, but I don't think the federal government should be involved in that. We, as the Romney administration or the Romney campaign, would not be able to create the kind of funding that the Obama administration has done for Race to the Top, for stimulus, for all kinds of activities which have added to the deficit. We're not proposing more money for public education. We're not proposing any cuts either, but we're not proposing more money for education. So we're always going to lose on the subject of creating economic incentives, which we don't think are the purview, frankly, of the federal government.
So I just have to, before I ask you on testing, I have to follow up on we're not proposing to cut. I think that came as a little bit of a surprise in the first debate, given that the Ryan budget would cut discretionary spending by, billions, billions of billions, enough so that you wonder how you could not cut education in that scenario.
Look, the attack on the deficits is all wrapped up in entitlements. It's certainly not on the periphery with public education or roads or prisons. It's a very, very, very small part of the budget. So 52 or 53% of the budget going to 75 are all wrapped up in entitlements. You can easily hold public education harmless without impacting the creation of more deficits, which we're opposed to.
Could you agree, John?
So I think we have a disagreement here that there's agreement, I think, in the country, and should be, that we need to be responsible about bringing down the debt and deficit, and that's very important. Within that, I think the question is, what do you see as a need for a cut or increase, and what do you see as an investment? I think a difference of philosophy, in my view, in this is that the president sees education as an investment in our future, and I think it's seen the way it's described as education is an expense that's got to be capped in Romney and Republican circles. And the president believes that we have to have modest increases, and his track record has demonstrated increases in education that, by the way, have led to now 10 million young people are benefiting from Pell Grants. We got from 6 million before we started. Millions of kids are benefiting from Head Start. So the question about the budget is a question of priorities and values, and I think that the Romney campaign on education is imprisoned by the Romney's budget policy. There's been estimates that have shown that in order for Governor Romney to increase funding for defense in the way he's described, and protect Social Security, and protect the various areas that he said need to be protected, when you look at the amount of discretionary funding other than defense, that over several years, that over 50% of those funds would need to be cut from somewhere. Now, until last week, it had been assumed that they would be, in some cases, he's used the description of across-the-board cuts to take effect the first year. I was pleased that the governor said there'd be no cuts in education, but there's no way the math holds up that you can protect education when you've got to cut non-defense discretionary funds by more than 50%. And if you did, you'd have to have even larger cuts to things like school breakfast and school lunch programs, and to veterans health care programs. And so for me, the math doesn't hold up in the Romney budget, which means that when we get to real presidency, the question is where are the candidates' priorities? And that's what they're going to fight for. And basically, I've seen again and again and again, the president has stood up for both reform, but also funding in education. I think the governor, good man, has said that there ought to be a smaller Department of Education, ought to be consolidated with other departments or shrunk a lot. He said money doesn't matter a lot in education. And so I think that Phil's described this. There's not a priority for growing the money to create incentives. And so I think you would see a dramatically different investment in education if you see a President Obama compared to if you see a President Romney.
I just comment that
I was going to ask.
John's characterization of investments is probably not exactly right. The stimulus package is 2 years of funding. I wouldn't call that a long-term investment in education. We've saved between 160 and, John would say, 400,000 jobs, but we're about to go off the cliff. The $100 billion is done, and we're back to where we began. Race to the top is the same way. It's short-term money, basically. None of the states who got race to the top money have complied with all the criteria that went with the money. It's not long-term investment. And so I would say you can't have it both ways. You can't put a lot more money into it on a short-term basis and call it an investment. It's just not.
But the president, the budgets have continued to reflect, modest increases, responsible modest increases over the years. And I would just say that investment, even the stimulus, which was the first part of his presidency, has produced enduring changes. You have people who are Democratic and Republican governors across the country who say that this has been a period of greater change and focus on improving education in the last few years than they've seen for decades. And that's in part because of a strategic use of funding that, by the way, it was a reflection of an idea of incentives for people to do the right things on things like reform, which does, you asked about NCLB reauthorization, it does reflect a move away from, I think under No Child Left Behind, there was some good ideas, and including shining a spotlight on achievement gaps for low-income kids and kids of color, and I think there was some good that was done by parts of No Child Left Behind. The fundamental flaw, I think, has proved to be that it's a one-size-fits-all mandate on the country, and I think we have to be very careful about what we mandate. And I think the president's moved through his incentive programs and Race to the Top and through the waiver process to incentivize states to do the right things, to give them flexibility from one-size-fits-all mandates. And I think that the approach of modest investments over the long term, with the burst of investments that was a small portion of the overall stimulus in education, combined with more flexibility, moving away from more of the one-size-fits-all mandates, I think is the right blend for the national level of education.
Just ask you just to nail this down. So if the ESEA got reauthorized, the president's proposal would look a lot like the waivers that he's giving now, but any significant differences?
So the president's basically prioritized that. The most important thing that the president and the Obama administration have said need to be constant, which have not been constant over the last decade or beyond, is that every state ought to have standards and expectations and assessments that reflect those, that reflect real rigor and true readiness for college and careers. And so there have been, in the administration's ESEA proposal, there have been proposals not to incent the Common Core specifically. This is an important difference. There's not been a proposal to incent the adoption of the Common Core standards, but there's a requirement that states have standards that reflect readiness for college and careers, and the Common Core is one way to get there. But the philosophy is if you have a much higher standard and are honest with kids and communities and parents about where kids are against this higher standard, then there should be a few areas of very important focus and prioritization, but a lot more flexibility on how you get there.
Phil, you wanted to talk about the waivers and No Child
Well,
Left
I want to
Behind.
talk about something else first, which John brought up, the Pell Grants, which again use that as an example of investment. But I would say honestly that there's $56 billion of deficit that we haven't figured out how to fund Pell Grants yet. So we're giving more money to more kids, but are accumulating, at least over the next several years, tens of billions of dollars of unpaid liability. We absolutely adhere to the Pell Grants. We like the Pell Grants. We think they belong in American education, but they need to be radically fixed. I might add that in the Pell Grant, which can be used for many different educational choices, it would be interesting to note that in K-12 we don't use Title I or IDA money for choice, and we think we should. And that I'll talk about waivers in just a minute.
Well, do you want to respond? I was going to do higher ed a little later, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, just a quick response on Phil's critique of the increase in Pell funding, and that's money that in the end may get increase the deficit. So again, here's what I'd say: when people in this audience and in Washington D.C. and people watching this online and people in the country look at the two candidates in education, there are genuinely major differences in the philosophy about what should happen on education. Major, decent people, major differences in what should happen, and this to me is a great one, and an important one. So the critique that increasing Pell Grants would increase the deficit, I think education is a very small part of the overall deficit and over the overall budget in the country. The president said it has to be an area we increase modestly in order to invest in and produce better outcomes. So increasing Pell Grants to help go from 6 million to 10 million students benefit from Pell Grants, which is huge. Today, 10 million students right now are benefiting from Pell Grants, low-income students. That's not just an investment in the students. We know from the data that 40 years ago, a high school degree was the minimal ticket to a middle-class job. Today, a college degree of some kind is. And the wage gap and the unemployment rates are huge gaps between those at the post-secondary education and those not. Our investment in those Pell Grants and low-income students going to college fuels our long-term economy, and that's not adding to our economic problem. It's actually adding to our economic solutions.
So I'm going to get back to higher ed affordability, but I'm still curious about No Child Left Behind.
Right.
What would happen in a Romney administration?
We've laid out in our white paper the criteria for our thoughts about reauthorization. We put forward a a reasonably provocative recommendation about Title I. There are basically in K-12 two kinds of money that come from the federal government to K-12 education. That's the 10% we've referred to several times here tonight, and that's Title I money and IDEA money for special needs children. And we have recommended that that money, like Pell Grants, should be given directly to the children. Again, under the philosophy that no child who's been born into a zip code should be obligated to necessarily go to a specific school. And so, and we've also said in Title II money, which is also part of the No Child Left Behind, that Title II money, which is about $2.5 billion, should be block granted to the states to be used the way states want to use for professional development, and it's primarily for teacher training and professional development. And we've said that, along with the federal government's first philosophy that I articulated earlier, that we should have a database and we should have data that empowers parents and gives them a real choice. So charter schools should be empowered, should be funded. And so there's we think that these waivers that are being given in lieu of reauthorization. If anybody hasn't seen a waiver, it's not about flexibility. Read one, there are 33 of them, 11 other states have applied, so there's arguably 44 states that are going to have waivers. They're very prescriptive. And we think that they have led to a very unfortunate result, which is just starting to play out right now, where we've given states the ability to set their own accountability standards. The law today prescribes proficiency for all students in year 2012. And these waivers have given the states the right to set their own accountability standards. It's been evidenced in the last several weeks, actually. It's a very topical subject. So many of these states are setting different accountability standards for different constituencies of children. So we're actually racially defining proficiency over the next 7 years as a result of waivers that are being given by the federal government. I think it's wrong. It's right back to where we began in terms of the soft bigotry of low expectations.
What would Governor Romney do about that?
We would reauthorize No Child Left Behind. And by the way, as it relates to waivers, there are presidential orders or executive orders, essentially. And I think in a Romney administration, we'd review all executive orders and determine whether they made sense or not.
So to clarify, states would be responsible for a common high standard, but the money would go to individuals to choose either charters or private schools or
public
other public
schools.
schools?
Where the law applied. So there are certain states, there are about 7 or 8 states where private schools are part of the choice program, and the Title I money would be allowed to be used for that, or for charters, or for online education, or for schools outside of the district, inside the district, depending on availability. That it's giving the parent the choice with their own money to decide where to send their child to school. Most of us in this room have that choice today. Why shouldn't everybody have that choice?
Do you want to respond, John?
I just want on the one question, if I can, the problem you're describing of states setting their own goals and different goals with different goals for different subgroups on education. What would what in the Romney plan would address that? What would the Romney administration do to address that? What you're describing as a problem?
We'd have to see what No Child looked like, but if it looked like the No Child Left Behind that is still the law, that the Obama administration is averting with waivers, we'd go back to some semblance of the law and set the same standard for all children. And that's, by the way, in Florida, which arguably has been since 1998 the most significant increase in the decrease. It has decreased the achievement gap the most significantly of any state in America. And I would contend that a large part of that is that we had one standard for all children. English learners, special needs kids, didn't matter. And as a consequence, we've seen the achievement gap narrow to almost nothing. And our our African American kids today score if they were a state, they'd be the 30th state in beating California and many other states. So one standard for all kids, which was No Child Left Behind initially, and we hope we would return to that.
So we agree on there's some issues that we addressed in terms of the president deeply focused on equity and moving all kids from all backgrounds toward high standards. I must say, though, Phil, what you're saying, I think, falls into the trap of some of the worst parts of No Child Left Behind. I think that what happened under No Child Left Behind, which again had some real good done to it, done by No Child Left Behind, there was some real damage too. I think one damage was that there were very prescriptive requirements for how states had to carry out their accountability systems and to carry out the implementation of No Child Left Behind through very prescriptive regulations, that in the end, in order to comply with all those and for the states to sort of look like they were doing well on all those and not have schools that were declared low performing, the states were then incented to lower the standard, and they set a lower standard with the kind of fill in the bubble multiple choice test reflecting that lower standard in order to meet that prescriptive kind of approach. And I think what the president's approach has been, and Arne Duncan's approach has been, is let's flip that. Let's be tight on the goals and have really high, rigorous goals, standards reflecting readiness for college and careers, and actually require that in some way. Common Core states could set their own as long as they were certified to reflect real readiness for college and careers, and give more flexibility. Now, there's got to be a focus on accountability too, but I think what you're describing could get us back to the prescription and then states lowering their standards instead of requiring a high standard and giving more flexibility to get there.
Let me just follow up on the choice part of Phil's answer previously. Using Title I and IDEA as essentially vouchers, right, to students to choose their school.
So President Obama has championed parental choice in public education.
Except in the DC scholarship program.
He's championed parental choice in public education as part of a broader package. I think he sees the evidence shows that parental choice is important if it's done along with actually investing funding and ensuring accountability to give kids opportunities for better choices in their neighborhood and better choices in their community. So as part of a package, it's good. My concerns with the Romney proposal, I have three concerns. One is that if you really focus mostly, and Phil began this debate saying the real focus for the federal government is transparency and choice. If you focus just on those things and you're willing to walk away from some of the funding that's needed to actually help schools improve, I think choices aren't meaningful. I think if you walk away from the accountability requirements, one of the pieces that Romney proposal, again, with all due respect to Phil, but is it would eliminate the requirement, as I understand it, for schools that are low performing to take action in pursuit of more flexibility. I think that if you have choice without the accountability and the funding, it's not real. The second concern I've got about the choice proposal is that I think it's an interesting idea that doesn't seem workable in a significant way at scale. I think that if you say to a low-income kid in a Title I school, in the Bronx, that you can take $700 in Title I funding and have that go toward a school in the suburbs, but you don't have transportation to get there. I think $700 in Title I funding doesn't, and without transportation, with suburban schools that often don't have spaces anyway, I just don't think, although I think there are ways of trying to do it in a small way, but to try to mandate that on the country, where you would say 50 states would need to, in order to get Title I funds, have to do that and use their state funds to do that, I think is taking an interesting idea and going too far and not providing the local choice that families need in their own communities.
So once again, to clarify, does the proposal for the vouchers include state and local funds coming along with the Title I or IDEA funds?
Let me just start by, I think it's sort of at the deepest philosophical level, it's the sort of ultimate hypocrisy to send your kids to private school and then veto DC scholarship program. That's not right. I mean, those poor kids should have the same right that we have to send our kids to whatever they want. And so the DC scholarship program has been opposed by this administration for the 3 years it's been in office, and it's a travesty. Those kids should be allowed to go wherever they want. That's the ultimate choice. So what we've said is that Title I money goes with states can match. There are 7 or 8 states today that would probably do that, and probably more if Title I money, which could be, John says 700, but it's probably closer. In some places, it's closer to $2,000 per student. And so it would actually have a real impact on on, we think the states either matching it or putting state funding with it and really driving choice. Parents, students should have choice about where they go to school. And we think that if you look at all these low-performing schools 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, unfortunately, sadly, they're still the same schools. We haven't done anything about it. We think that there needs to be some disruption in the system, and we believe that choice and giving parents the ability to send their children where they want is part of that disruption.
One last quick comment.
Yes.
So I think the question is, what is an effective disruption, as you put it, in order to give families a choice of better schools in their community? And to me, the $700 or the average, $800, $900. There may be a few places it's $2,000, but it's generally under $1,000. The idea of providing that amount and suggesting that that's going to give the families a meaningful choice to go to a school elsewhere, I just think isn't real. Again, I think there are interesting ways to take the proposal and designed and try some things out, but I don't think it's designed well enough to mandate that 50 states do it. Whereas I think the disruption the president has talked about and proposed, and actually has been, and Arnie Duncan, his secretary, have been executing on, has to require that low-achieving schools take really dramatic steps to turn around and improve. And many people are familiar with the Title I school improvement grants that have really helped lots of low-performing schools around the country begin to make very significant change in terms of the teaching quality and the curricula and the support decided at the local level with funding and accountability requirements to support that. I think ultimately reforming existing schools and expanding access to public charter schools give better chance of getting real choices in a child and family's community than a $700 or $100,000 to support going to a suburban school.
One last title.
Dr. Burrow, I would say is that the federal government has a limited role in public education. It's primarily Title I and IDA money. It may not we think it'll be the significant catalyst to get this choice effort started. It may not have all of the characteristics that we would need in terms of total student funding, but the federal government's role should be to get this choice started.
One more Title I or No Child Left Behind question, and that has to do with the prevalence of testing. I know you've talked about new kinds of tests, but in this city we have a growing parental backlash against testing. We read every day about some new scandal involving testing. What are your proposals about standardized tests?
About stopping scandals?
Standardized tests, yes, not scandals.
Well, certainly testing is taken on a bad brand name for sure, and it's happened in Florida, and it's happened not only here in New York, but around the country. But unfortunately, that's what we have to do to properly assess students. And it's going to be an interesting political dilemma whether politicians, these 46 governors who have signed up for Common Core and who have signed up for new assessments, are going to have the political courage to actually implement them. And this next couple of years will be a very, very interesting time to see whether that happens or not.
John?
So look, mediocre tests are a problem and need to be replaced in my view, and I think with the president's leadership can be replaced by much better assessments that measure the kind of things that we really care about our kids learning. It's not just filling in a bubble in a multiple choice test. I think one of the problems with the No Child Left Behind Act is it required this kind of testing, but then didn't provide the funding to actually even implement and design better tests, so you often had to sort of dumb down the kind of tests that were available, and I think that's a problem. It's created real backlash. So that's got to be addressed with much better assessments that are useful in giving information to students and families and teachers to help figure out how to improve how kids are doing. I think every school we've seen that's made progress, and dramatic progress, has had good assessments with useful information that help people make improvements. And I think the design and the use of assessments in a good way is important. But at the same time, the bigger problem is not tests. And I think the backlash is understandable, but has to be addressed through better assessments. But the real backlash should not be against tests, even though they should be addressed and replaced with better assessments. The real backlash should be against the fact that in this country, we are nowhere where we need to be in education in terms of actual performance. We once were #1 in the world in educational performance 40 years ago. The US has slipped to number 14, 16, 22. It's not because we've gotten worse. We've just not gotten better, or a little bit better. And the demands on our kids have gone way up in order to get good jobs and participate successfully in an information-driven society. And so the real question is, how do we actually stop the stagnation or slight incremental improvements we've had and make much bigger progress? And I think that's the big fight, even though we have to address the assessment issue in an effective way along the way.
Did you want to say anything in response?
No, I think that states need to take a much more offensive marketing role in this and stop playing defense. I think there's I agree with John that we need to enhance our assessments, and under Common Core, assessments are going to get more prevalent rather than less prevalent and hopefully more meaningful. For example, we're going to have to find secure online devices to be able to start taking tests in a more realistic way than sitting down at a desk. And the funding for that from the state point of view will be significant, but needs to be made.
Let me move on to teachers and teaching. Recent research shows that the teaching force is becoming younger and younger. The term being used is the greening of the teaching force, and that more teachers are leaving within their first 5 years than ever before. Right now, the modal years of experience in the teaching force is 1. What do you think your candidate would do to support teaching and the teaching profession so we can stop this leaky bucket?
Well, to discuss this at Teachers College obviously is very relevant. In Florida, because our teacher population has grown older and people have retired and gone out of the system, we hire approximately 20,000 teachers a year. The schools of education turn out 6,000, of which 3,000 end up teaching in our public schools in Florida. And yet, we call everybody other than the 3,000 alternatively certified. So the first thing we need to do is, I think, take a whole new approach to the constraints about how people, very capable people, can come into the teaching workforce. And we think that there's a much different approach. For example, I mentioned Title II money in IDA should be given in a block grant to the states and let them begin to open the pathways for people from all kinds of walks of life to be teachers, well-qualified teachers. We're recommended, by the way, in terms of the IDEA reauthorization, we would take out highly qualified as a prerequisite. We think it develops some constraints to getting, like TFA, into the classroom.
So the evidence is pretty clear that the number one in-school factor, as you note, Susan, driving improved student success is the quality of teaching in the school. Sometimes that gets misinterpreted to mean that if just a teacher just works harder and just tries harder and does better, that somehow that's going to solve everything. When in fact, I think what the president's approach has been, we actually need a systematic focus on how do you attract, retain, develop, so we can have teachers at all levels really excel, tapping the research base that's been developed across the country, including here, to understand how kids learn and how to succeed. So the president's had a 3-part plan on teaching quality and would build on that in a second term in a significant way. Number one is to give, on an opt-in basis, opportunity for school systems across the country to really truly professionalize teaching, to create career ladders that would give opportunities for people to who are successful advance into having roles where they could be lead teachers, support other teachers' success, become instructional coaches, to really redesign the whole way that a teacher kind of goes through a career where, today most people in most jobs and sectors don't, spend 30 years in one position. People should be able to do that, but part of the reformed Teacher Incentive Fund program that has just given grants across the program, which used to be more about performance pay, the president's broadened that and said, how do you really make teaching and school leadership a performance-based career where you can kind of grow and develop in lots of roles? And a teacher evaluation system is a component of that. The second thing the president's doing has been supporting the reform of preparation of teachers in the first place. And there have been support for programs, including teacher residency programs, where teachers get year-long residencies to prepare to become teachers based in part on what a model the president knew very well in Chicago, and he's visited a number of times before he was president, the Academy for Urban School Leadership in Chicago, where teachers are very carefully recruited and selected, spend a year in residency working with master teachers selected for that purpose, have really rigorous training in a partnership with the local university, and then go in cohorts of teachers into schools to improve low-achieving schools. And that model has created a lot of great teachers and had great results in actually being disruptive and improving low-performing schools. So expanding that kind of model in teacher preparation. And the third thing the President's been focused on, and now Secretary Duncan have been focused on and will be, is how do you provide more incentives for people to go into teaching and reduce the student loan debt and the financial obligation that people take to go into teaching. And there's been some significant strides in making it easier to get loan forgiveness, paying off loans for people who go into and stay teaching for several years.
So one hypothesis about why many more teachers are leaving than before is the accountability system, some of which you referenced, specifically with respect to teachers, the use of standardized test scores in teacher evaluation, for example. What do you think your candidate's position is on the use of those tests to evaluate teachers and to attach consequences to them?
So the President and Arne Duncan as Secretary have been clear that we have to help develop teachers and give them the capacity to succeed. In order to develop teachers, as good as kind of one-shot occasional professional development can be designed, the way you really help teachers succeed is through ongoing significant feedback from skilled leaders, principals, and instruction leaders to help them improve. And in most careers, you have as a basis for that teacher evaluation or performance evaluation systems that gives data to managers and employees on saying, here's how we're doing and here's the information we need to give feedback. So the President and the Secretary and the administration have seen teacher evaluations as a part of a way to give feedback that's needed to help teachers improve, and also to see which teachers are doing well, to give them a chance to take on other roles. And yes, that when in a fairly designed system, if there are teachers that are not doing well and have support after they've been identified as low performing, that there actually are mechanisms for ensuring that those teachers are not in front of kids, whether counseled out or dismissed. And that's not anywhere near the majority of teachers, it's a small subset, but tackling that problem in some ways, along with supporting the development of the vast majority of teachers who can succeed, the President thinks is a better way to offer better choices for kids than many other strategies. In terms of the test score question, the President and the Secretary have been clear that the improved achievement of kids should be one among multiple measures in a teacher evaluation system, and that they think that an evaluation system that doesn't include a look at whether kids are improving isn't really serious about helping people understand what kids are learning. A system that only looks at that is missing very important feedback around how teachers are doing against rubrics around professional practice, around improvement. So it's really got to be a blend of multiple measures, and that's been the President and the Secretary's policy, and I think it'll continue to be.
Phil?
We agree, obviously, on the importance of the teacher as the most significant characteristic in the classroom. We don't think it's the role of the federal government to be mandating these kind of evaluations of teachers. We happen to agree with them, but we don't think they should be mandated either by waivers or by federal prescription.
Okay, let's move on to the higher education issue that I said I'd return to. So we started a conversation on affordability, talking about Pell, but that also has to do with student loans and indebtedness, and I'd like your sense of how your candidates would address the growing issue of student debt and making college more affordable to more students. John, you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
So, unless you would like to, Phil.
No, you're the incumbent.
So, on all of these issues, I think one of the things the President, from the first time I got to know him, recognized and has seen is there are examples of success across this country, whether it's pre-K programs that are preparing kids for success in kindergarten, K through 12 public schools are succeeding, or post-secondary institutions that are doing really well in improving how the kids are doing, students are doing, completing college, managing costs. And so I think that the successes in some ways have informed the President's policies, as well as the urgent need for investing in post-secondary education, college affordability for students. So specifically, the President has, in addition to, I mentioned the Pell Grants, and we got 10 million students on Pell Grants, and there's a big focus, but the reform of the student loan program that the President championed successfully, didn't get everything he wanted, but got a lot, was very significant in essentially moving the student loan program to now a direct loan program fully. And the benefits of that, there were about $80 billion, $70 or $80 billion approximately that were saved in the shift from kind of essentially the subsidies for the banks for those loan programs to actually being available to help support students. And there were three ways in which that $70 to $80 billion were used. One is it increased Pell Grants and helped us get to the 10 million students benefiting from Pell Grants today. Number two is it enabled a big investment in community colleges, which are a very important part of training workers for kind of high-skilled jobs in this economy. And third is it enabled, and I think this hasn't gotten enough attention, but a really significant enabling of an income-based repayment plan that is still moving fully into effect, where soon a student will be able to essentially pay only 10% of their discretionary income. And won't have to pay more than that, and then that can be paid, essentially be forgiven after 20 years to make the student loan debt more manageable. And that investment in student loans is kind of representative of the kind of approach needed now. Costs in post-secondary education are a significant issue. Interesting, in the last 4 years, that for students overall, that net costs have actually not gone up because of the president's policies, that the investments in loans and Pell Grants have actually been more than the increase in tuition costs. Moving forward, the president has proposed a really significant race to the top for post-secondary education that would incent post-secondary institutions and states to both measure and improve their ability to complete students in college, to get students all the way to complete college, because we've got a big college dropout problem that doesn't get talked about enough, and to help incent those places that would actually manage their costs better in order to make sure we don't have the continued rising costs we have. So this will continue to be a major focus for the president in a second term.
Phil?
Well, student debt, as most of you know, has become a $1 trillion portfolio, more than all consumer debt put together. So it's a very large issue. And I would say that starting to forgive student debt is sort of like a creeping entitlement. We're about to begin giving people the ability not to pay back their debts in the student area. There's a lot of things that can be done that haven't been done by this administration. For example, their attitude toward for-profit education has been very negative. And I think, again, if you read our white paper, that would recommend that we do away with what's called the 90-10 rule and the gainful employment rule, both of which are driving up tuition, as is higher Pell Grants actually driving up tuition probably, as opposed to what I said before, we're creating huge debts at the federal level and huge debts at the student level. John has suggested that the student loan program has been monopolized at the federal government level, and private lenders have been taken out of the industry. We would recommend that, again, given our attitude toward competition, that private lenders be allowed back into the industry. We think we'd see more competition, we'd see more efficiency, we'd see more choice for students in the process. I think there's several other areas of higher education which need to be talked about, like workplace development. Our recommendation is that, again, not surprisingly, we would recommend that over $20 billion a year in 47 programs that don't really produce a product, don't really produce jobs, should be given directly to the recipients and let them use that the way they want to get job training, as opposed to give it to the federal government and let them administrate it. So generally there's much more, I would say, choice that should be given to kids and their parents. The same transparency, truth, data collection needs to be evident in higher education, as we suggest it should be in K-12 as well. So the hope is that we would have data sets and not have to rely on U.S. News and World Report, but obviously have a much more effective information technique for giving kids a choice, a proper choice.
But I think choice among unaffordable loans is not a real choice. I mean, if I may, I wonder what would Governor Romney do in order to, I mean, it's a really issue in terms of college debt, in order to promote college affordability.
The one thing we do with Pell Grants, for example, is have a completion requirement. So, for example, in Florida, we have Florida virtual schools. Florida Virtual School offers a course and gets paid at the end of the course when a student is proficient in that course. And that should be the same with federal programs which allow kids to go to school, not complete school but still get the money, not complete the course but still get the money. There's a much more rigorous criteria that should be, I think, administered as it relates to giving out federal money for going to school and not completing a course or completing a program.
I think I hear you mentioned the return. One policy you mentioned was returning the loan program to the not being direct loan, but to the banks. And that was that was done for a while, and the switch, of course, has been now made to the direct loan program. And there are still private companies and banks participating in that. It's just they're as contractors now to the federal government as opposed to kind of getting the subsidies to the banks in order to be the originators of the loans. There is a market role for that. The question, though, I have is kind of, if you did that, what would you do to replace the funding that actually has made possible the Pell Grants, the investment in community colleges, the income-based repayment? I mean, to me, if you have a responsible income-based repayment plan, it's been paid for by the elimination of the subsidies to the banks as middlemen, that's not contributing to the student debt problem, it's helping it by making the debt more manageable. And I just think Pell Grants, increasing them, I think it's just such a priority. I have to say, my wife, Elisa, is here in the front row, so glad that she's here. She went to college with help from a Pell Grant. And I think there are millions of people around the country who wouldn't have the chance to go without Pell. And I think finding ways to both reform Pell, but also improve access to it for millions of kids is just crucial.
I guess what we would say is that the reform is essential. So building a $56 billion deficit from Pell Grants is not acceptable.
Well, the Romney and Ryan budgets would double or triple the shortfall to $100 or $150 billion. And so the question is, where does the funding come from to pay for it? And my concern about the Romney budget overall is when you have to cut discretionary and domestic funding by over 50%, you don't have funding to be able to address shortfalls like that, whereas the president has laid out some of these clear steps because of his investment in education to help address the shortfall.
So college...
I look forward to the macroeconomic discussion later.
College completion is certainly, affordability is important, but so is preparation. And we all realize that very important non-school factors affect a student's readiness for college and for the workplace. It's not just how good schools are as much as we want to improve schools, but certainly poverty, living in violence, health conditions, safe neighborhoods are all critical to success throughout students' lives. What would your candidate say about the non-school factors and the role of federal policy in addressing them?
It's a much broader issue. I think that as it relates to the school system, this is what we're focused on in terms of our policy. I mean, there's a great many social programs that obviously go into that, but what we've learned over the years, whether it be in Harlem or Bronx or Miami or Jacksonville, that all children can learn regardless of it would be fantastic to improve home life and to improve social environments, but we have learned that kids can learn, and we should assume that they can learn and I think behave accordingly.
So I think the evidence shows that kids, including kids in poverty, when they have access to high quality expectations and support instruction, can make dramatic progress in a way that many people don't believe. But the evidence is clear. We've had way too low expectations for our kids, especially kids from low-income backgrounds, kids of color, kids who've been underserved, and we've had too low expectations of all kids. So part of the overall arching part of the president is how do you support state and community efforts to raise those expectations and support kids and teachers' ability to achieve those expectations. The evidence also shows is that schools are not everything. I think some people would suggest you shouldn't tackle school reform until you fix poverty. I think we'll never get to that unless we support schools. Other people would suggest you only focus on schools without focusing on other issues, including nutrition and counseling and social services and healthcare. And for kids who live, people in this audience, kids live in poverty, they can succeed, but there are a lot of barriers that have to be addressed both academically and non-academically in order to support that. Some of the most successful models we've seen support that. I see Pam Cantor here tonight from Turn On Schools. This is a great example of how you combine the work in schools. So I think that the president has supported that with funding to support efforts like the Harlem Children's Zone across the country. That's been very important. And I think the president's budget priorities, he has proposed a way to deal with $4 trillion in cuts to be fiscally responsible, but to cut discretionary domestic spending by over 50% over time, including for things like social welfare programs and health programs and nutritional programs and education programs, I think just doesn't allow you to make that progress, which is why I said we've got to be responsible. We've got to make sure we invest both in schools and not out of school issues to help our kids, especially kids in poverty, succeed.
So I'm going to now ask you the most popular question. It was suggested by every segment in the faculty, our community here, and our friends in Washington, and that is, what are the candidates' stances on early childhood education? Phil, we'll start with you.
Well, we have the primary federal role in early childhood education is Head Start. And we think, again, as part of our proposal, that the Head Start should have different criteria and different elements of success. It has been allowed to go on for decades, not as an academic experience, unfortunately, but much more as a social experience, not preparing children for school, which we think early childhood education. We have started in Florida preschool education funded by the state, and we think that's very legitimate. There's a lot of states that have started what they call pre-kindergarten, and we think that's an important part, but not an important part for federal participation unless there's real criteria associated with it.
And at the federal level, I was going to ask a question, but I guess I'll wait to that. So having seen the president from when he was senator, I'd say there is nothing that he is more passionate about in education and maybe beyond in terms of domestic policy than investment in quality early learning for young kids. In the 2008 debates, I remember he was asked education, none of the moderators asked questions about debates, but in each debate he responded with answers about education. He was asked about what's something he would do to invest in our long-term economic growth, and he said that we got to invest in early learning. So when the stimulus came along, he insisted on making sure that there was, in fact, investments in expanded Head Start programs. But the key is not only investing more funding, he's also, like other parts of his education agenda, says, look, we got to make much better use of existing funding. And so the administration has implemented regulations of a law that was passed with bipartisan support a couple years before, but in a very aggressive way, to reform Head Start by actually ending contracts with low-performing Head Start programs and actually giving more contracts to those Head Start programs that are really demonstrating results serving young kids. And to me, this is a great example of his philosophy, which is some people would say you need more funding, but when things aren't working, you just keep more funding going. Some people would say you kind of ignore that and maybe reform things, but you don't add funding, and that doesn't really expand access. And the president's approach has been, how do you both invest and make dramatic changes in the way the programs are working? I think you'll see and also in this first term, he had a very large early learning proposal that was as part of this SAFRA Act that was basically trying to apply the savings from the student loan program, and at the last moment in Congress, things were taken, investment in early learning was taken out, which was a real disappointment. But he's had an early learning race to top challenge, which states across the country, Democratic or Republican states, have come together and applied for funding for how they redesign the early learning systems, and I just think you're going to continue to see in a second Obama term a major focus on how do we really expand not just the quantity but the quality of access to early learning.
So this goes beyond Head Start and beyond 3- and 4-year-olds. It's beyond disadvantaged kids.
Yeah, so it's he's very focused on the needs from kids from 0 to 5, and how do you support creation of systems that include Head Start, that include childcare, quality childcare, that include state programs. And the early learning race at the top was a competition that gave funding to states to actually help design how do you stitch together in a way building on, Governor Hunt has really, in North Carolina, created the Smart Start program, which is one model for how you stitch together these programs for kids really from birth to 5. And he's focused both on Head Start and 3 and 4-year-olds, but really looking at how to support state and community efforts to help kids all the way to get ready for success in kindergarten. If you don't do that, you can catch up with kids for sure, but it's much harder and it's much more expensive. So he thinks that both the outcome gains you'll get, but actually the cost savings you'll get by doing a good job on the front end are huge.
And Phil, just to be clear, you pretty much confined your remarks to Head Start as for the federal role.
I know it won't be popular in this audience, but you just can't keep adding to the deficit. And you can create all these programs, but we don't think it's an appropriate role for the federal government to keep adding to these programs.
I just think it's true. I mean, the question is, you get, as a president, you get to make a few priorities about what are the things you focus on. What are the things that you lead on? What are things that make sure when push comes to shove, when all the political squabbling ends, what are the things that you're really going to make sure get done? And I think the choice that the country has between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, it includes that Barack Obama, at the end of the day, year after year, is going to make a major focus on supporting kids from a young age through K through 12 through college affordability, and doesn't regard those as just a set of these programs. There are other cuts that are needed. There's differences over taxation for the wealthy. But I do think you see a legitimate difference of philosophy about whether you prioritize education as president, both investments and reform, that I think, in my view, if we make the right choice to do that, the consequences will not only be so huge for kids' access to opportunity in this country, but it'll drive good jobs or economic competitiveness, not by itself, but it'll help. I think if we don't make that one of the few priorities, and if it's just a set of these programs that may not get cut or may get increased a little bit, but aren't a huge focus, I think it's not the right choice for the country.
I would say that Governor Romney, having been the governor of Massachusetts, as we learned that in the last debate with an 87% Democratic legislature, made education a very high priority in his administration in Massachusetts. They finished with the highest standards, with the highest NAEP scores under his tutelage as governor. He believes in education, proved that he did, and couldn't get a bipartisan support for doing that. But that doesn't mean including increasing the federal deficit in the process.
He built there was a lot of progress over time in Massachusetts that made Massachusetts very successful, and the governor maintained that. And even did a couple things to try to build on that, and some didn't pass, and some got passed, some didn't get passed. That leads me to say I might vote for Mitt Romney for governor. But I don't think that that's the basis for electing him to be president on education.
So I am wondering if you're giving your closing statement a little prematurely.
Sorry.
Certainly felt like it.
Yeah. I have a question from the Education Week audience. The arts and humanities, they've always been such an important part of our education and our lives as productive citizens and as citizens who enjoy life. So how can we preserve them at a time when they tend to be the first things cut?
So part of the introduction, which was not included, was I served as the vice chairman of the Institute of Educational Sciences, which is the research arm of the Department of Education, which focuses on education research. And I will say, over the last 10 years, we've significantly enhanced the quality of educational research and brought it far from where it should be, but brought it to a level of credibility that heretofore it didn't exist. But to your question, there has been a myth about courses, and that in the last 10 years that we've actually decreased music, arts, and other social sciences. The actual data would indicate that we haven't done that. So we've actually maintained our level of continuing education in the arts and other social studies and history at a time when we tried to focus more importantly on reading and math. But I don't believe that that's a crisis that needs to be cured. I think it's actually in terms of arts education, probably have a status quo versus 10 or 5 years ago.
So part of the President and the administration's ESEA reauthorization is to provide support for kind of a well-rounded education for arts and for music. And look, I see it on our own kids in schools. I visit around the country. The arts can, done right, play such a role in helping spark kids' curiosity, get kids to school. I think and the data, I think Phil's right, actually, I think shows that there hasn't been the significant pullback on those programs nationally that sometimes people suggest. At the same time, I think the question is, how do we, as a country, invest deeply in kids, especially who are behind, their ability to read well, to write well, to do math, and to have the arts and music programs as well. And I think this is a classic example of a both and, which really is getting solved by places, especially for the highest poverty communities, in places that wind up having longer school days and longer school years. And saying, look, you know what, if kids are behind, that they may need more time in a school day and more time in a school year, so that they do get focused. They need the focus on reading and literacy and math and the science. They need the arts and the music. You can't do that in a shorter day. Again, that does require some cost, but if you do it right in a responsible way, in a targeted way where it's needed most, it can be done in a way that sort of pays off and reduce our costs as a society over time.
So let me ask about education research, since you brought it up. So this is the privilege of the chair. The investment in education research is less than the investment in any other sector, and that includes private sources as well as the federal government. You cited the federal role in data collection and research as one of its most important roles. So would you support enhanced funding for educational research?
Yes.
John?
And Phil's demonstrated that. I mean, Phil is a great leader and a great person and a committed advocate for education in many ways, including his role on educational research and his role in Florida. And so that yes is real. I assume, in fact, that Ron...
Thank you for enhancing my answer, John.
I just can't stand short answers, so I have to do something about them. It's one of my developmental needs. The investment in research is so key. You can't really do that in a sustained way if you're cutting domestic non-defense discretionary funding by more than 50% a year. I think it's just, there are so many things that can cut. It's just very hard to do. So I'm thrilled to hear Phil say that, but in that kind of budget policy, that and so many things are going to be at risk, even if there's an interest in supporting them.
Okay. And one final question from the DC audience has to do with whose voice is heard in education. I would put in a plug for the researchers, but other people want to know about teachers and students. And how do their voices get included in education policy making? If not at the federal level, how would you encourage states and localities to include their voices? Phil?
Well, we have 14,000 school districts and therefore 14,000 school boards. It is a phenomena that school board elections are ignored by parents and by many people in the in the community. I would urge folks to be much more involved in school board races where we really have a chance with most school boards are 5 or 7 people without much. You could change the complexion of the outcome significantly by being involved in the school board races. Most people don't pay any attention to it, and I would say that's at the fundamental level. That's where most policy is really made. That's where contracts are negotiated. That's where policy is made. That's where textbooks are done. That's where a lot of voices should be heard, and I'm afraid they're not.
So I'll not only speak for myself, but I'll tell you a little story of what I saw from the president before he was president that relates to your answer. And I was in New Orleans. He was in New Orleans in 2007. And my wife, Elisa, and I were there. And our daughter had been born at a New Orleans hospital. We were there post-Katrina. And my son and I, who's 2, went over to a school where the Senator Obama, was visiting a New Orleans school as part of a day of service, and gave a speech there. And what he most wanted to do, and he sat in a classroom, I saw him do this, he sat with a set of students in the classroom in this New Orleans school, and some city year corps members who were helping to fix up the school. And he sat and he just asked them questions, and listened, overstayed the amount of time he needed to stay there because he so much wanted to hear from students and city year corps members in New Orleans. And I think that what he heard from them significantly informed his policy overall, including his views about New Orleans over time. And I do think that students have the most profound insights about education, and we need to do much more to leverage those. I think the president has demonstrated that personally. I also think that, and there are some efforts to try this out, I think that incorporating, you talked about teacher evaluations, for example, there's some research that some of you are familiar with that shows that if you ask students the right questions, that is one measure, not the only measure, not the majority measure, but is one measure in a teacher evaluation, to ask students questions like, that relate to the teacher's sense of expectations for the student. If the student's not getting something right, does the teacher help them? That asking the right questions to students can actually be a very important part of giving teachers evaluation and feedback as part of their evaluation systems too.
Okay, now it's time for your closing statements. and since we started with the question for Phil first, we're going to let you go first this time, John.
So I think I'll end with what I started with in a way. The debates about any policy issues can wind up getting to lots of important details. I think at the end of the day, when you're looking at any candidate on an issue, I think what's most crucial to look at is what are their demonstrated core beliefs and priorities over time. And then when you get into the Oval Office, and there's so many things competing for your time, I think no one can imagine before they get into that situation how demanding your schedule is, how little time there is for anything you might think. And what priorities you carry with you is a fundamental conviction that need to be addressed will ultimately, and how, will wind up driving your policies. And when I saw in, again, this brink of economic catastrophe, President-elect Obama in early 2009, millions of jobs in the process of being lost, the economy in free fall, him addressing that, but taking the time to make sure that the country was going to be investing in the long-term economic future by focusing on investing from young kids to public schools, to access to college, and insisted on that being part of a, quote, an economic stimulus package that wouldn't work, he thought, without investing in the long term. To me, that shows the kind of priorities that he's got, and I think his policies have continued to reflect that on issue after issue tonight. I think you'll hear that gets reflected in Head Start programs and programs 0 to 5 and investments in reform in public schools and promoting college affordability, all within a fiscally responsible context. And I do think that the contrast on education, and I have respect for Mitt Romney, I have huge respect for Phil Handy, but I think that the view of budget policy that the governor has, and the view of the states not only being the driver, which the president believes and is trying to give more flexibility on, but the belief that the federal government should be consolidated or shrunk a lot, and that these various issues are not for federal involvement, I do think represents a significant contrast between the two. And I think sometimes people say, hey, are Romney and Obama similar on education because Romney said good things about Arne Duncan and Romney said good things about Race to the Top, and they might, if they were in a state legislature, find some agreement on some issues. I think the question is not what they would do in a state. The question is what you campaign for president. And I think you govern typically how you campaign, and I think that the way they've campaigned and the way they've spoken about education reflects this dramatically different view, whether you focus on education in a significant way or you don't. And the president will if he's reelected, and it's why I'm such an admirer of his.
Oh.
Thank you, John. We'll begin end where we began, which is the role of the federal government. And I think we all need to be mindful of the fact that there are a lot of things that we want in education, and what role should the federal government play in that? And we do have some fundamental disagreements about that. The attempt by this administration to go around the No Child Left Behind law by giving out all of these waivers I think we view it very, very differently than they view it. We think it prescribes states, restricts their flexibility, as opposed to, and we're seeing that played out over the last several weeks. We think the federal government should be involved in collecting data and being transparent about the data at the state level. And we think that ultimately choice should be given to parents to create competition in the public school system. And that is fundamentally what we believe. I think this administration believes differently in terms of their mandate to make states do what they want to do. We believe that states have been the laboratory for change, have been the laboratory for reform, and will continue to be that. And we have plenty of evidence, whether it be Indiana or whether it be New Orleans or whether it be Florida, where change has come about because we have reform-minded governors, not because it's being pushed by the federal government. And that's a very different policy, which you would like to have many different programs, but they should come from the states, not from the federal government.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much. I don't know if our web audience can see Phil's socks,
Sort of,
which I just noticed, but they're bright orange. And I'm glad that I didn't notice them earlier. I would have been completely distracted. And you both had
I knew I didn't have that much going for me in this audience.
You both had so many interesting things to say that I'm glad that I wasn't distracted. Thank
Our
you
comments
so
were more
much.
interesting than his socks. Thank you,
Right.
Susan.
Well, it was kind of a low bar. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, buddy.
So let me also thank Education Week, thank the International Reading Association, thank especially Phyllis Kossoff, and remind you all that we do have a debate with Jeffrey Hennig, our faculty member, Allison Klein of Education Week, Liz Willen of the Hechinger Report, and Matt of Education Week will be moderating, so that please stay and enjoy that follow-up panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the International Reading Association, the professional home for literacy educators. Our mission is to continually advance the quality of literacy instruction and research worldwide. IRA's resources address common and complex challenges in literacy instruction and provide high-quality solutions you can rely on. If you're a literacy professional who wants to feel confident that the way you teach, lead, or practice is proven to be the most effective, become an IRA member.